Hey everybody, my name is Ted Forbes. Welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. Today we are talking about The Decisive Moment Part 2. We did The Decisive Moment Part 1 in our little mini-series here a few episodes ago, and I talked pretty extensively about the work of famous photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson and how much, he's a huge influence on me. And just to recap a little bit, The Decisive Moment, it was the title of a book that he put out with the famous cover by Matisse. But it was also, it's known as his approach or his motto, if you will, or his ethos towards photojournalism is finding this decisive moment in time where something happens and that's what you're capturing from, the perfect angle on the camera. And Bresson, the guy made it look easy. And, because he had so much experience and so much, classical traditional training in a compositional sense, he made that happen pretty regularly. One thing I want to make as a correction is, the famous shot that I used of the guy jumping over the pond that I used for my example in that. I have been corrected that actually was a lucky shot Bresson says he got, and he says so in a few interviews that you can find in various places. And what's interesting is that, in my mind, makes him even that much more of a great photographer, having to wedge the camera between some planks and a fence and not even be able to see through the viewfinder and being able to sense when that moment is coming. And I think that really does embody the decisive moment. It wasn't a lucky 2 minutes that Bresson had. I guess it was in a way, but it was 2 minutes plus 20 years of, making pictures before that and all the training he had that led up to that. And that's what great photographers do. And I think he is no exception to that. Today I want to shift gears a little bit and I want to talk about somebody I did know. And this is a little bit from personal experience and some things I learned. This is a photographer I've actually never talked about on the podcast before for various reasons, but there was a gentleman who, by the name of Greg Booth, who lived in Dallas and was probably one of the most in-demand commercial photographers throughout the late 70s, all the 80s, and into the 90s. And Greg did an enormous body of work, mainly was commercial work, but it's interesting, his career, unfortunately, and he was a family friend, our family were friends with theirs, and I grew up knowing this guy. His career ended rather, I guess sadly, but very strangely too. He actually had a brain aneurysm at one point, which kept him from working ever again. And he has since passed away a couple years ago. And because I think he was such a mentor to me, whether or not he knew it, but a very dear friend. Back when I was doing web design, I worked very closely with them and did their first website for the studio he owned. He owned a studio, and then he spent the bulk of his career on the road 200 days a year in foreign countries, shooting stuff for annual reports and magazines and you name it. Brilliant photographer, and one of the most interesting human beings I've ever known. And Greg never ever used the term the decisive moment. In fact, Greg was the personality where, if you ever asked him about somebody like Henri Cartier-Bresson, he would probably laugh and play dumb like he didn't know who he was, and he was just kind of a nut like that, and he knew exactly who he was. Greg's career started, he went to Art Center, probably, I'm going to guess, in this early 70s, and after going to Art Center, he interned with the great photographer Arnold Newman in New York, only for about a month. And basically Arnold told him, look, you need to be shooting and go out and do it. And he stayed friends and stayed close with Arnold for years and years after the fact. When I was growing up, I remember we used to go over to their house for dinner, and they had a print of the famous Stravinsky Portrait. And I'll find this in the B-roll and I'll stick it over the top, but it's the one with the piano edge where Stravinsky's against this stark contrasted shape. Sometimes this is known as B-flat, or, because it looks like either the flat sign or the lowercase b. In either case, I remember going over there seeing that photo, and it had such an impact on me. This very curious, tightly designed black and white work that, I think that photo probably is what made me want to become a photographer later. There was something that just, you couldn't get your mind off about that. And obviously it's one of Arnold Newman's famous photos. But anyway, back to talking about Greg. A year ago, and I'm still very good friends with Greg's wife. She continued to run the studio that they owned for years that did a lot of catalog work. And last year for Christmas, as a gift, she and my dad had given me one of Greg's pieces. I'm going to show it to you. It's actually on this wall back here, so I'm going to move the camera and I'll do a little bit of B-roll, and then in a minute I want to talk about it because it was such a great Greg story. Okay, so this is the image. This is a rather huge print, and it's one of my favorites. And I'm sorry I'm way down here in the bottom, but I want to get this in. I'll go over the top and shoot some B-roll of some of the details. But anyway, this is St. Basil's Cathedral, which is part of Red Square in Moscow. And the whole story is that this is actually, Greg was on assignment in Russia, and this was actually a personal piece that he made. And what the whole deal was is that he had been out to dinner with the client, I assume, and was coming home, a taxi cab had passed this beautiful cathedral, which if you've ever seen this before, it looks a little bit different. But it was the way that it was lit, kind of subdued the colors, and you know, certainly the fact that it's in winter and there's snow on top of the I guess what you call the spiral things. Anyway, very beautiful picture, but Greg didn't have his camera with him. So basically what he did is he paid the cabbie to take him back to the hotel, paid him to wait, ran upstairs, got his camera, tore down, got the guy to come back over to Red Square, found the perfect angle to get this, got out of the cab, went over, focused up, took this picture, was about to readjust and get a second one, and all the lights went out. And so anyway, if that's not a decisive moment, I don't know what is. And certainly, I think you could say that this is, you know, if he'd waited 5 more minutes, he wouldn't have had the shot. But anyway, this is such a beautiful picture and one of my favorites. I'm going to zoom in and get some close-ups. But what's interesting about this shot that I think really make it are the people in the front that are having a conversation with the big winter hats and coats. And the fact that the lighting and the color are so unusual on it, especially if you see what this looks like, you know, in person or today, it's really quite an exquisite image. But my whole point here is that you know, when I talked about the decisive moment before with Bresson had a very, you know, a very cool, stealth, patient, almost a cat-like sensibility of waiting for the picture and all the elements to line up correctly. And Greg was the opposite. He would go make his own decisive moments, and he would make them happen. He was one of the craziest individuals I've ever met. In fact, I don't think there's an image I've seen of Greg's that there wasn't some kind of funny story that was attached to. And so anyway, so I'm giving you 2 kinds of different perspectives. I'm sorry I don't have a scan of this. I'm actually having to show it to you on my wall, but I think getting a sense of the scale is pretty interesting as well. Unfortunately, Greg's career was cut pretty short right around the time the internet was becoming popular, and he had a brain aneurysm that actually put him out of work. He survived another 10 years before he passed away, but I think it was very difficult, and unfortunately I think and Greg would have never said this, but I will, that, you know, I think it's very unfortunate there's a whole generation of photographers who don't know who he is. And I think because he was a personal friend, I haven't really discussed it much on this show. I have talked to Carol, his wife, who I'm still very good friends with, and we've worked together on an enormous amount of projects. And you know, Carol went on to run the studio and actually did that up until recently. And I think she would be a good person to have on here, not only to talk about Greg's philosophy and his way of taking pictures, but also I think she would be a good interview because she has experience with business and running a photography studio, which I think is really important as well. So anyway, I know I'm really small and in the bottom here, but we will get on that in the coming weeks. We've got some other stuff coming up this week. I should have my darkroom chemicals here tomorrow. I don't think I'll be printing this big on the minimalist darkroom setup. That was a joke, by the way. But you know, hey, we'll have some fun with it anyway. Anyway, hey guys, thanks again for watching. Once again, this is The Art of Photography. I'll see you next time.